The violent crack of a Winchester rifle split the morning air as Willow Thornfield steadied herself against the weathered fence post, her amber hair whipping around her face in the fierce Wyoming wind. She hadn't expected to find herself facing down a rattlesnake on this particular April morning in 1876, but life in Cottonwood Springs rarely went according to plan. As the snake's body twitched in the dust, Willow lowered her rifle and drew a steadying breath, one hand instinctively moving to rest on her still flat stomach. "Good shot," came a deep voice from behind her, "though I reckon that snake would have moved along on its own." Willow turned to find a tall figure silhouetted against the rising sun. Even without seeing his face clearly, she recognized the broad shoulders and easy stance of her neighbor, Kirk Blackwood. The man had a way of appearing when least expected, like some sort of prairie apparition. "I don't take chances with rattlers, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Not anymore." Kirk stepped closer, his features coming into view, the strong jawline, weathered skin bronzed by the sun, and those eyes the color of a summer storm. He tipped his hat respectfully. "Can't say I blame you. Just passing by on my way to town, thought I'd check if you needed anything fetched." Willow hesitated. Since her husband Thomas had died 6 months ago, the neighboring ranchers had been kind, perhaps too kind. Their pity was almost unbearable. "I'm fine, thank you." "The spring planting is nearly done." Kirk nodded, his gaze drifting across her modest homestead, the small cabin Thomas had built with such pride, the struggling vegetable garden, the 3 milk cows grazing in the distance. "You sure you're managing all right out here alone?" "I'm not alone," she said, the words coming out before she could stop them. She paused, having told no one yet about the child growing inside her, Thomas's final gift. "I'm quite capable, Mr. Blackwood." Something in her tone must have convinced him, for he simply nodded and remounted his chestnut stallion. "Well, offer stands if you change your mind. Town's a fair ride from here." As she watched him ride away, Willow felt the familiar ache of loneliness settling back into her bones. She had been a schoolteacher back east before Thomas had swept her off her feet with tales of building a new life in Wyoming territory. Now she was a widow at 23, expecting a child in a land that showed little mercy to the weak. Willow returned to the cabin, carefully placing her rifle back on the hooks above the door. The morning sickness had been terrible these past few weeks, though thankfully it seemed to be easing. She had to be strong for herself, for the baby, for the memory of Thomas. This land might be harsh, but it was hers now, and she intended to make it bloom. The days stretched into weeks as spring firmly took hold of the Wyoming landscape. Willow's garden began to flourish under her careful attention, and the secret life growing inside her became her constant companion through the lonely nights. She wrote letters to her sister back in Boston, cheerful missives that never mentioned the hardships or the fear that sometimes kept her awake until dawn. It was early June when the first real trouble came. Willow woke before sunrise to the sound of her cows bellowing in distress. Grabbing her rifle, she hurried outside to find 2 men attempting to herd her livestock toward the north boundary of her property. "That's far enough," she called out, raising her rifle. "Those are my cows you're stealing." The men turned, surprised to find themselves facing down a woman with a Winchester. The taller one, a wiry man with a pockmarked face, gave a slow, unpleasant smile. "Well now, little lady, we was just helping these strays back to their proper place," he drawled. "These here carry the Circle B brand, don't they?" "They carry my brand," Willow said firmly, though her heart pounded in her chest. "The Thornfield T, you can see it plain as day." The second man, younger and clearly nervous, glanced at his companion. "Frank, maybe we should shut up," the man called Frank snapped, then returned his attention to Willow. "A woman alone has no business running cattle. Why don't you be reasonable and sell these to us for a fair price, say $5 a head?" Willow's finger tensed on the trigger. "The price is you leaving my property right now, before I put a hole through that hat of yours." What might have happened next, Willow never knew, because at that moment, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. Kirk Blackwood rode into view, his expression grim as he took in the scene. Two of his ranch hands flanked him, both armed. "Problem here, Mrs. Thornfield?" Kirk asked, though his eyes never left the would-be rustlers, Frank's confidence visibly diminished at the arrival of reinforcements. "No problem, just a misunderstanding about some strays." "Those cows are branded clear enough," Kirk said coldly, "and you're trespassing on Mrs. Thornfield's land. I suggest you boys ride on before the sheriff gets involved." The mention of the sheriff was enough. With muttered curses, the two men mounted their horses and rode off, though not before Frank shot Willow a look that made her blood run cold. When they were gone, Willow lowered her rifle, suddenly aware of how badly her hands were shaking. "Thank you," she said quietly as Kirk dismounted. "Though I had the situation under control." Kirk's expression softened slightly. "No doubt you did. But Frank Mercer and his crowd have been causing trouble all across the county. They're not men to face alone if you can help it." One of Kirk's ranch hands, a friendly-faced man named Ben, tipped his hat to Willow. "We were riding the boundary line and heard the commotion. Lucky timing, I reckon." "Lucky indeed," Willow agreed, then swayed slightly as a wave of dizziness washed over her. Kirk was at her side in an instant, one strong arm steadying her. "Mrs. Thornfield, are you all right?" Willow nodded, embarrassed by her weakness. "Just, haven't had breakfast yet this morning. The excitement got to me." Kirk studied her face with concern. "Ben, ride ahead to my place and tell Mrs. Holloway to fix up a proper meal. We're bringing Mrs. Thornfield back with us." "That's not necessary," Willow protested. "I'm perfectly fine." "Those men might come back," Kirk said firmly, "and you're looking pale as a ghost." "My housekeeper makes the best flapjacks this side of the Mississippi. Consider it neighborly concern." Too exhausted to argue further, Willow allowed herself to be helped onto Kirk's horse. As they rode toward the larger Blackwood ranch, Willow found herself painfully aware of Kirk's presence behind her, his arm occasionally brushing hers as he guided the horse. It had been months since she'd been this close to another person, and the human contact, even this innocent, made her heart ache with loneliness. The Blackwood ranch house was a substantial two-story structure of solid timber and stone, surrounded by well-tended grounds and outbuildings that spoke of prosperity earned through years of hard work. As they approached, an older woman with silver-streaked hair hurried out to meet them. "Land's sakes, Mr. Blackwood, what's all this about?" she exclaimed, eyeing Willow with curiosity. "Mrs. Thornfield had some trouble with rustlers this morning," Kirk explained as he helped Willow dismount. "She needs a good meal and some rest." "Of course she does, Mrs." Holloway agreed, taking Willow's arm. "Come in, dear. You look like you haven't had a proper meal in weeks." The interior of the Blackwood home was surprisingly refined for a bachelor rancher. Polished wooden floors, comfortable furniture, and shelves lined with books spoke of a man who valued comfort and education. Willow found herself seated at a large oak table while Mrs. Holloway bustled about the kitchen, producing a breakfast that would have fed half a dozen ranch hands. "I can't possibly eat all this," Willow protested as plates of flapjacks, eggs, bacon, and biscuits appeared before her. "Just eat what you can," Kirk said, taking a seat across from her. "Mrs. Holloway takes it as a personal insult if folks don't at least try her cooking." Despite her protests, Willow found herself ravenous. Between bites, she studied her host more carefully. Kirk Blackwood was likely in his early 30s, with the lean, muscular build of a man who worked alongside his hands rather than merely directing them. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, and while his clothes were practical, they were of good quality. There was an intelligence in his gray eyes that suggested he was more than just a successful rancher. "How long have you lived in Cottonwood Springs, Mr. Blackwood?" she asked, curious about this neighbor who had now twice come to her aid. "Going on 12 years now," he replied. "Came out from Missouri after the war with nothing but a saddle horse and the clothes on my back. Worked as a hand for the old Double R outfit until I saved enough to buy my first 100 acres. He smiled slightly, "Been adding to it ever since." "It's impressive what you've built," Willow said sincerely. Kirk shrugged, looking almost embarrassed by the compliment. "Been fortunate." "Good land, good cattle, good hands makes all the difference," he He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Your husband had the right idea picking that parcel. Good water, sheltered grazing, he was building something fine. The mention of Thomas brought the familiar pang of grief, but Willow nodded. He had such plans. The house was just the beginning. He wanted to build a proper barn next, then expand the herd. She looked down at her plate. He always said next year would be easier. It's hard country for anyone starting out, Kirk said quietly. Harder still for someone alone. Willow straightened her shoulders. I'm not giving up. This land is all I have left of him, of our dreams together. I wasn't suggesting you should, Kirk clarified quickly. Just that there's no shame in accepting help sometimes. Neighbors look out for each other out here. It's how we all survive. Before Willow could respond, Mrs. Holloway returned with a pot of coffee. As she reached to pour Willow a cup, Willow shook her head quickly. No thank you, Mrs. Holloway. Just water for me, if you don't mind. The housekeeper raised an eyebrow but complied without comment. Kirk, however, was more observant. His gaze flickered from the rejected coffee to Willow's face, then briefly to her midsection before returning to his own plate. Willow felt her cheeks warm, realizing he had likely guessed her condition. Mr. Blackwood, she said, deciding that honesty was best, I should probably tell you that I'm expecting. The words felt strange on her tongue, having never been spoken aloud before. Thomas's child. Due sometime in November, I believe. Kirk's expression revealed nothing beyond polite interest. I see. Congratulations, Mrs. Thornfield. You're the first person I've told, she admitted. I haven't even written to my family back east yet. Your secret's safe here, he assured her. Though it does change things somewhat. It changes nothing, Willow said firmly. I'm still perfectly capable of managing my homestead. Kirk smiled slightly. I've no doubt about your capabilities, Mrs. Thornfield. I just meant that we'll need to be more vigilant about keeping an eye on your place, especially with men like Mercer causing trouble. After breakfast, Kirk insisted on escorting Willow back to her homestead. As they rode, he pointed out features of the landscape she hadn't noticed before: the best grazing areas, signs of water beneath seemingly dry creek beds, the distant mountains that served as landmarks. Your land joins mine on the east boundary, he explained, which makes us natural allies against troublemakers. When they reached her cabin, Kirk hesitated before helping her dismount. Mrs. Thornfield, I hope you won't take this amiss, but I'd like to send one of my hands over occasionally to help with the heavier work. Ben's got a gentle way with livestock, and he's handy with repairs. Willow's pride warred with practicality. She knew the coming months would only get more difficult as her pregnancy progressed. I can't pay much, she said finally. Consider it an investment in a good neighbor, Kirk replied. And maybe come harvest, you can send over some of those tomatoes I saw growing in your garden. Mrs. Holloway makes a fine tomato preserve. It was a compromise that allowed Willow to maintain her dignity while accepting the help she desperately needed. As Kirk rode away, Willow found herself watching his retreating figure longer than necessary, wondering about the man who seemed determined to be her protector, whether she wanted one or not. The summer heat settled over Wyoming territory with an oppressive intensity that made every task twice as difficult. By July, Willow's condition was becoming more evident, her dresses growing tighter across her expanding waistline. True to his word, Kirk had sent Ben over regularly to help with the more strenuous chores, and occasionally Kirk himself would ride by, often bringing small gifts: fresh bread from Mrs. Holloway, a jar of honey, once even a bolt of soft cotton fabric that Willow used to begin making baby clothes. It was during one of these visits in late July that disaster struck. Kirk had just finished helping Willow repair a section of fencing when a violent summer storm blew in from the mountains with frightening speed. The sky darkened to an ominous green-black, and the wind picked up until it seemed to scream across the prairie. "We need to get inside," Kirk shouted over the rising gale. "This is turning into a bad one." They barely made it to the cabin before the first marble-sized hailstones began to fall, quickly followed by a deluge of rain so heavy it seemed to form a solid wall of water. Inside the cabin, Willow lit a lamp as thunder shook the very foundations of the small structure. "I've never seen a storm come up so fast," she said, pressing a hand to her rounded belly as the baby kicked vigorously, seemingly disturbed by the commotion. Kirk moved to the window, his expression grim as he watched the hail intensify, stones now the size of eggs pounding against the glass. "Your garden's going to take a beating." Willow joined him at the window, dismay filling her as she watched months of careful tending being destroyed in minutes. The corn stalks bent and broke under the onslaught, and her precious tomato plants were already shredded, but worse was to come. A particularly violent gust of wind tore across the property, and before their horrified eyes, the roof of Willow's small barn lifted clean off, tumbling away like a discarded piece of paper. "No," Willow cried, instinctively moving toward the door. Kirk caught her arm. "You can't go out there." "It's too dangerous." "But the cows," she began, "would want their owner to stay safe," Kirk finished firmly. "There's nothing to be done until the storm passes." The tempest raged for nearly an hour, battering the little homestead with nature's full fury. When it finally passed, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake, the extent of the damage became clear. The garden was completely destroyed, the barn was half collapsed, and the chicken coop had vanished entirely, though a few bedraggled hens had somehow survived and were pecking disconsolately at the muddy ground. Willow stood in the doorway of her cabin, surveying the devastation with growing despair. 6 months of work destroyed in less than an hour. The careful plans, the painstaking planting and tending, all gone. Without the gardens produce to see her through the winter and to sell in town for necessities, she didn't know how she would manage. Kirk stood beside her, his own expression somber. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Thornfield. What am I going to do?" she whispered, more to herself than to him. Kirk turned to face her, his gray eyes serious. "You're going to rebuild, and I'm going to help you." "Why?" The question escaped before she could stop it, raw with emotion. "Why do you keep helping me? You barely know me." Something shifted in Kirk's expression, a momentary vulnerability that surprised her. "Because it's what decent folks do, and because—" He hesitated, then seemed to change his mind about what he'd been about to say. "Because I know what it's like to face impossible odds alone." Over the next few days, Kirk brought a crew of his ranch hands to help salvage what they could of Willow's homestead. The barn was beyond repair, but they managed to build a temporary shelter for the cows using salvaged lumber. The garden was a total loss, but Kirk assured her there was still time to replant some fast-growing vegetables before the first frost. It was during this time that Willow began to see a different side of Kirk Blackwood. Despite being one of the largest landowners in the county, he worked alongside his men, his hands as calloused and dirt-stained as theirs. He seemed to have endless patience for showing Willow how to repair what could be fixed and rebuild what couldn't. One evening, as the sun was setting after a long day of work, Willow found Kirk sitting alone on her front porch steps, staring out at the horizon. She joined him, lowering herself carefully beside him. "Thank you," she said simply. "I don't know what I would have done without your help." Kirk nodded, his profile gilded by the fading sunlight. "You'd have managed. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for." "Perhaps," Willow conceded, "but I'm glad I didn't have to find out." She hesitated, then asked the question that had been on her mind for days. "Mr. Blackwood?" "Kirk," he interrupted gently. "After all this, I think you can call me Kirk." "Kirk," she amended with a small smile. "Have you ever been married?" If the personal question surprised him, he didn't show it. "Once, a long time ago." "What happened?" Willow asked, then immediately regretted her boldness. "I'm sorry, that's none of my business." "It's all right," Kirk said quietly. "Her name was Sarah. We married young, right before I joined up with the Union Army. She died of typhoid while I was away fighting. I came home to an empty house and her fresh grave." He spoke matter-of-factly, but Willow could hear the old pain beneath his words. "I'm so sorry," she said, instinctively reaching out to touch his arm. Kirk glanced down at her hand, then covered it briefly with his own. "It was a different life. Sometimes feels like it happened to someone else." He looked up at the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. "Is that why you came west, after losing your husband?" Willow shook her head. No, Thomas and I came together. He had such dreams about building something of our own, away from the crowded cities and his family's expectations. We'd been here almost a year when She swallowed hard. When he fell from the roof while making repairs last autumn, he lingered for 3 days, but there was nothing to be done. And you stayed, Kirk observed. Many would have gone back east. This was our dream, Willow said simply, and now it will be our child's inheritance. I couldn't abandon it. They sat in companionable silence as darkness settled fully over the prairie. In the distance, a coyote called, its lonely cry echoing across the open land. You should get some rest, Kirk finally said, rising to his feet and offering her a hand up. Tomorrow we'll start replanting what we can. As August turned to September, Willow's pregnancy advanced, making even simple tasks challenging. Her back ached constantly, and the summer heat seemed determined to sap what little energy she had. Still, with Kirk's help and Ben's regular assistance, they managed to replant a modest garden and make the necessary repairs to see the homestead through the coming winter. Kirk's visits became a regular part of Willow's life, something she found herself looking forward to with increasing anticipation. Sometimes he would bring books from his own library, novels, poetry, even scientific journals that they would discuss during quiet evenings on her porch. Other times he simply helped with chores, working in comfortable silence beside her. It was during one such evening in late September, as they sat shelling the first harvest of peas from the replanted garden, that Willow felt the first sharp pain. She gasped, her hand flying to her belly. Kirk looked up sharply. What is it? Nothing, Willow assured him, though her voice was strained. Just the baby moving. But when a second, stronger pain followed minutes later, she couldn't hide her discomfort. Kirk was immediately at her side, concern etched on his features. This isn't normal movement, he said, his voice calm but serious. How long have you been having these pains? Just now, Willow admitted, fear beginning to creep into her voice. But it's too early. The baby isn't due for another 6 weeks at least. Kirk helped her to her feet. I'm taking you to town to Dr. Gardner. It's probably nothing, Willow protested weakly, even as another pain gripped her. Then the doctor will tell us so, Kirk said firmly, already guiding her toward his waiting horse. The ride to Cottonwood Springs was a blur of increasing pain and mounting fear for Willow. By the time they reached the small town, she was barely able to stay in the saddle, Kirk's strong arm around her waist, the only thing keeping her upright. Dr. Gardner, a kind-faced man in his 50s, took one look at Willow's pale, pain-contorted face and immediately ushered them into his clinic. After a brief examination, his expression grew grave. The baby's coming early, Mrs. Thornfield, he said gently, and it's not positioned correctly. I'm going to do everything I can, but I want you to prepare yourself. The next hours were the worst of Willow's life. Pain unlike anything she had ever experienced tore through her body in relentless waves. Dr. Gardner worked tirelessly, his hands steady even as worry creased his brow. Outside the examination room, Kirk paced like a caged animal, refusing to leave despite the doctor's suggestion that he return in the morning. It was just past midnight when a different cry pierced the air, the weak, mewling sound of a baby born far too soon. For one breathless moment, hope flared in Willow's heart. Her child was alive, but the hope was short-lived. The tiny boy, perfect in every way except for his size, took only a few labored breaths before falling silent in Dr. Gardner's hands. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Thornfield, the doctor said, his voice breaking. He was just too early. Willow's anguished cry echoed through the small clinic, a sound of such raw grief that it brought tears to the eyes of the doctor's wife who had been assisting. They placed the tiny, still form in Willow's arms, where she cradled him close, memorizing his perfect features through her tears, Thomas's nose, her own mouth, impossibly tiny fingers complete with miniature nails. When Kirk was finally allowed in, he found Willow sitting up in bed, her face tear-streaked but composed, her arms empty. The doctor had taken the baby away to prepare him for burial. Willow, Kirk said, using her given name for the first time. The single word carried a world of compassion. His name was going to be James, she said, her voice hollow. After my father. Kirk crossed the room and without hesitation sat on the edge of the bed and drew her into his arms. Willow went rigid for a moment, then collapsed against his chest, her grief finally breaking free in great, heaving sobs. Kirk held her through it all, his own eyes damp, one hand gently stroking her hair as she cried for her son, for Thomas, for all the dreams that seemed to keep slipping through her fingers like prairie sand. The baby was buried the next day in the small cemetery on the edge of town. Dr. Gardner had crafted a tiny coffin from a wooden medicine crate, lined with the softest flannel his wife could find. Reverend Simmons said a few words over the grave, but Willow barely heard them, her mind still unable to comprehend that the child she had carried for 7 months, had talked to and planned for and loved, was gone. Kirk stood beside her throughout the brief service, his solid presence the only thing keeping her upright. When it was over, he took her back to his ranch rather than to her homestead, insisting that she needed proper care during her recovery. Too exhausted and heartbroken to argue, Willow allowed herself to be installed in a comfortable guest room where Mrs. Holloway fussed over her, bringing broths and teas she couldn't taste and speaking gentle words she couldn't hear. For 3 days, Willow barely left the bed, drifting in and out of a grief-stained sleep. On the 4th morning, she woke to find Kirk sitting in a chair beside her bed, a book open in his lap though he wasn't reading it. When he realized she was awake, he set the book aside. "How are you feeling?" He asked softly. Willow considered the question. The physical pain had subsided to a dull ache, but the hollowness inside her felt permanent, a space that would never be filled. "I don't know," she answered honestly. Kirk nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Mrs. Holloway made fresh bread this morning. Do you think you could eat something?" The thought of food still held little appeal, but Willow recognized the concern in Kirk's eyes. "I'll try," she promised. That afternoon, Kirk helped her outside to sit on the wide porch of his home, wrapping her in a blanket against the autumn chill. From there, she could see the sprawling operation that was the Blackwood ranch, the well-tended pastures, the sturdy barns, the bunkhouse where his hands lived. Everything spoke of careful planning and years of hard work. "Your ranch is beautiful," she said, the first unprompted words she'd spoken in days. Kirk, who had been sitting quietly beside her, looked pleased. "Thank you, it's been a labor of love." "How did you do it?" Willow asked. "After you lost Sarah, how did you find the strength to build all this?" Kirk was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. "At first, I didn't think I could," he finally admitted. "I came west because I couldn't bear to stay in the place where we'd been happy together. For the first year or so, I was just running away." He gestured toward the horizon. "But there's something about this country, the openness, the challenges, the beauty of it that wouldn't let me hide forever." Willow understood exactly what he meant. Even in her grief, she could feel the power of this wild, beautiful land. "Will it ever stop hurting?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kirk's hand found hers, warm and calloused. "Not entirely," he said truthfully. "But eventually, you learn to carry it differently. It becomes part of you rather than something that consumes you." Willow nodded, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. For the first time since losing the baby, they were quiet tears, not the wrenching sobs that had torn at her chest for days. "I don't know what to do now," she confessed. "Everything I was planning was for him, for the baby." "You don't have to decide anything right now," Kirk assured her. "You can stay here as long as you need, and when you're ready, I'll help you with whatever you choose to do next." 2 weeks later, Willow felt strong enough to return to her homestead. Kirk insisted on accompanying her, concerned about how she would react to being back in the place where she'd planned to raise her child. As they approached the small cabin, Willow steeled herself against the expected wave of grief, but instead found herself noticing things she hadn't before: the way the autumn sunlight gilded the prairie grasses, the cheerful chirping of birds in the cottonwood trees by the creek, the distant silhouette of mountains that had witnessed centuries of human joy and sorrow. "It's still beautiful," she said softly as Kirk helped her down from the wagon. "It is," he agreed, his eyes on her rather than the landscape. Inside, the cabin was just as she had left it, though someone Mrs. Holloway, Willow guessed, had come to dust and air it out. On the small table sat a vase of late wildflowers, their bright colors a stark contrast to the simple furnishings. Kirk brought in her bags, setting them by the bedroom door. "Ben's been looking after your livestock," he explained. "The cows are doing well, and he managed to round up most of your chickens. They're laying again." "Thank you," Willow said, overwhelmed by the kindness that had surrounded her through her ordeal. "For everything?" Kirk nodded, clearly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "I'll come by tomorrow to check on you. Mrs. Holloway sent enough food to last you a week, but if you need anything before then, I'll be fine," Willow assured him, managing a small smile. "Really?" After Kirk left, Willow moved slowly around the cabin, reacquainting herself with the space that had been her home for nearly 2 years now. In the small second room that was to have been the nursery, she found the cradle Thomas had built the previous winter, its smooth pine surface lovingly sanded and oiled. Beside it stood the chest where she had been storing the baby clothes she'd sewn, each tiny garment representing hours of hopeful anticipation. The sight might have broken her a week ago, but now Willow found she could look at these things without being crushed by grief. She ran her fingers over the cradle's curved edge, remembering Thomas's proud smile when he'd presented it to her. He would have been a wonderful father, and she had wanted so desperately to be a mother. "Maybe someday," she whispered to the empty room. October brought the first frost, painting the prairie with silver and bringing a sharp clarity to the air. Willow gradually resumed the rhythms of life on her homestead, tending to her livestock, preserving the modest harvest from her replanted garden, and preparing for the coming winter. Kirk continued to visit regularly, often bringing supplies or helping with repairs, though Willow noticed he was careful to treat her with the same respectful distance as before her loss. It was during one such visit, as they worked together to split and stack firewood, that Willow realized something had changed between them. There was an ease to their interactions now, a comfortable familiarity born of shared hardship and mutual respect. Kirk no longer felt like just a kind neighbor or even a friend. He had become something more, though Willow wasn't ready to name what that might be. "You're getting stronger," Kirk observed as Willow hefted an armload of split logs. "A month ago you couldn't have carried half that." "Work is good medicine," Willow replied, echoing something Mrs. Holloway had told her. "Keeps the mind occupied and the body tired enough to sleep." Kirk nodded, understanding in his eyes. He had been working particularly hard that day, his shirt damp with sweat despite the autumn chill. As he swung the axe, splitting another log with practiced precision, Willow found herself admiring the fluid strength of his movements. The realization that she was noticing Kirk as a man, not just as a helpful neighbor, brought a flush to her cheeks that had nothing to do with exertion. That evening, as they sat on her porch drinking coffee, which Willow had finally resumed enjoying, Kirk seemed unusually pensive. "Penny for your thoughts," Willow said lightly. Kirk hesitated, then set his coffee cup aside. "I've been thinking about your barn," he said. "Winter's coming, and that temporary shelter won't be enough once the snow flies." "I know," Willow sighed. "I've been saving to hire help for rebuilding, but it will take time." "I have a proposition," Kirk said, his tone carefully neutral. "My men are between major projects right now, with the fall roundup finished. I could spare 3 or 4 hands for a week to help build you a proper barn before winter sets in." Willow straightened, immediately wary. "That's very generous, but I couldn't possibly accept such charity." "It's not charity," Kirk said quickly. "More of a business arrangement. In exchange, I'd like to graze some of my younger stock on your south pasture next spring. It has better early grass than my lower fields." Willow studied him suspiciously, almost certain he was creating a convenient excuse to help her. "And that's worth the cost of a new barn. Good grazing land is precious," Kirk said with a straight face, though his eyes held a hint of amusement. "Do we have a deal, Mrs. Thornfield?" Despite her suspicions, Willow couldn't afford to refuse. "We have a deal, Mr. Blackwood." True to his word, Kirk arrived the following Monday with 4 of his best hands and a wagon loaded with lumber. Over the next 6 days, Willow watched in amazement as a sturdy new barn took shape on the foundation of the old one. The men worked with practiced efficiency, and Kirk himself was there every day, directing the work and lending his own considerable strength to the task. By Saturday afternoon, the barn stood complete larger and sturdier than the original, with proper stalls for the milk cows, a hayloft, and even a small tack room. The men celebrated with a hearty meal that Willow prepared, her pantry nearly emptied to feed the hungry workers. As the hands headed back to the Blackwood ranch, Kirk lingered, surveying their handiwork with satisfaction. "It's perfect," Willow said, standing beside him. "Far better than what we had before. It'll see you through many winters," Kirk agreed. Then, somewhat hesitantly, he added, "There's one more thing." He led her around to the side of the barn that faced her cabin. There, attached to the wall and sheltered by the overhanging roof, was a small covered area with a wooden floor. Hanging from the sturdy beams were two chains supporting a simple but beautifully crafted porch swing. Willow stared at it in confusion. A swing? Kirk ran a hand through his hair, suddenly seeming almost shy. "I thought, well, it gets lonely out here sometimes. Thought you might like a place to sit of an evening. Watch the sunset." Willow approached the swing, running her fingers over the smooth wooden seat. It was a completely unexpected addition, serving no practical purpose for the running of the homestead, yet somehow it touched her more deeply than all the practical help Kirk had provided. "Did you make this?" she asked, noticing the careful craftsmanship. Kirk nodded. "Last few evenings after the men left. It's not fancy, but the wood is good white oak. It'll last." Willow sat down on the swing, testing its sturdiness. It moved with a gentle sway, the chains creaking slightly. "It's lovely," she said softly, "but why a swing?" Kirk was silent for a moment, his eyes on the distant horizon where the sun was beginning to set. "My grandmother had one on her porch back in Missouri," he finally said. "She used to tell me it was where she did her best thinking." Said the gentle motion reminded her that life keeps moving forward, even when we think we're standing still. He paused, then added more quietly, "And I thought, someday you might want to sit here with children, the ones yet to come." The words struck Willow like a physical blow. Children yet to come. The simple phrase acknowledged both her loss and the possibility of future joy in a way that nothing else had. Tears sprang to her eyes, but for once they weren't tears of grief. "Thank you," she whispered, unable to express how much the gesture meant. Kirk simply nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I should get back," he said, though he made no move to leave. "The men will be wondering where I am." "Stay," Willow said impulsively. "Just for a little while, watch the sunset with me." After a moment's hesitation, Kirk joined her on the swing, his solid presence beside her comforting rather than intrusive. They sat in companionable silence as the sky blazed with color, orange and pink and gold painting the clouds and reflecting off the distant creek. "It's beautiful here," Kirk said eventually. "You chose well." "Thomas chose it," Willow corrected automatically, then paused, considering. "But I've made it mine now, I think." Kirk turned to look at her, his gray eyes serious in the fading light. "Yes," he agreed, "you have." November brought the first heavy snowfall, blanketing the prairie in pristine white. With the barn completed and her winter preparations in order, Willow found herself with more time for reflection. As Thanksgiving approached, she realized with some surprise that despite the terrible loss she had suffered, she had much to be grateful for: her health, her home, neighbors who had become friends, and most especially, Kirk Blackwood's steadfast presence in her life. Kirk continued to visit regularly, though the worsening weather sometimes kept him away for days at a time. When he did come, he often brought books or news from town, and they would spend hours talking on evenings when the weather was too harsh to sit outside on the swing. Willow learned about his childhood in Missouri, his brief but terrible experiences during the war, and his dreams for the future of his ranch. In turn, she told him about her life in Boston, her years as a schoolteacher, and her first meeting with Thomas at a church social. "He made me laugh," she recalled one snowy evening as they sat before her fireplace. "I'd always been so serious, so focused on my teaching, but Thomas could find humor in anything. He said life was too short to spend it frowning. Kirk smiled, firelight playing across his features. "He sounds like a good man." "He was," Willow agreed. "I think you would have liked each other." The thought no longer brought pain, just a gentle nostalgia for what had been. As December arrived with its short days and long nights, Willow found herself looking forward to Christmas for the first time since Thomas's death. She baked cookies from Mrs. Holloway's recipes and made simple gifts for the Blackwood Ranch hands who had helped her sew much knitted scarves, jars of preserves from her garden, hand-carved wooden buttons for Ben, who had mentioned needing them. For Kirk, she worked on a special gift in secret, a hand-bound book of her own poetry, something she had written throughout the difficult year as a way to process her grief and hopes. It felt terribly personal to share, but also right somehow, given all they had been through together. 2 days before Christmas, a fierce blizzard descended on Wyoming territory, howling across the prairie with a vengeance that kept everyone huddled indoors. Willow wasn't concerned at first. Her woodpile was ample, the barn secure, and her pantry well stocked. But as the storm entered its second day with no sign of abating, she began to worry about her livestock. The journey from the cabin to the barn, normally a short walk, became treacherous in the blinding snow and bitter cold. On Christmas Eve morning, Willow bundled up in every layer she owned and fought her way through snowdrifts to check on the animals. The cows were restless, sensing her anxiety, and it took longer than usual to feed and water them. By the time she headed back to the cabin, the wind had intensified, driving the snow horizontally with such force that she could barely see 2 feet ahead. Disoriented, Willow paused, trying to get her bearings. The cabin should be directly ahead, but the swirling white made it impossible to be certain. Taking a deep breath, she pressed forward, each step a struggle against the wind and deepening snow. When her foot plunged into an unseen drift, sending her sprawling face first into the snow, panic gripped her heart. The cold was already seeping through her layers, and she knew the dangers of exposure all too well. Forcing herself back to her feet, Willow squinted through the blizzard, desperate for any glimpse of her cabin. Was that a darker shape ahead, or just a trick of the swirling snow? She stumbled forward, her legs growing heavier with each step, the cold numbing her face and hands despite her gloves and scarf. Just as despair began to set in, the vague shape solidified into the welcome outline of her cabin. With renewed determination, Willow pushed forward the final few yards, her frozen fingers fumbling with the door latch. The warmth that greeted her as she stumbled inside was so intense it brought tears to her eyes, the contrast to the bitter cold outside almost painful. Shivering violently, Willow shed her snow-covered outer layers and moved closer to the stove, her teeth chattering too hard to speak. It took nearly an hour before the worst of the chill left her body, and by then, the light outside was already fading, though it was barely mid-afternoon. The thought of venturing out again to check on the animals in the evening filled her with dread, but she knew it had to be done. As she prepared to face the storm once more, a sound outside the cabin caught her attention, not the howl of the wind, but something more rhythmic. Hoofbeats. Before she could reach the door, it burst open and Kirk Blackwood stumbled in, snow coating his hat and shoulders, his face barely visible behind a frost-covered scarf. "Kirk," Willow gasped, astonished. "What on earth? Thought you might need help with the livestock," he managed through chattering teeth as he shed his outer garments. "Storm's worse than any I've seen in years. You rode all the way from your ranch in this." Willow couldn't believe anyone would attempt such a journey. "You could have frozen to death." Kirk stamped his boots, sending snow scattering across the floor. "Wasn't about to let you face this alone on Christmas Eve." He looked around the cabin, noting the preparations for her solitary evening, the small evergreen branch decorated with paper stars, the single-place setting at the table. Besides, no one should be alone at Christmas. Once Kirk had warmed himself by the stove, they ventured out together to tend to the animals for the night. With 2 of them working, the chores were completed quickly, and they were soon back in the snug cabin where Willow prepared a simple but festive meal of roast chicken, potatoes, and the last of her summer carrots, preserved in a sweet glaze. "It's not much of a Christmas feast," she apologized as they sat down to eat. Kirk looked at the carefully prepared food, the cheerful pine branch with its paper ornaments, and the single candle illuminating the table. "It's perfect," he said sincerely. After dinner, with the blizzard still raging outside, they sat before the fire, drinking hot cider and sharing stories of Christmases past. Kirk spoke of holiday traditions, from his childhood hanging stockings for his younger siblings, midnight services at the small church in his hometown, sledding parties on crisp winter afternoons. Willow described the elegant celebrations of her Boston youth, with carolers in the streets and elaborate decorations in the family parlor. "Last Christmas was difficult," she admitted. "It was only 2 months after Thomas died. I couldn't bear to celebrate." "And this year?" Kirk asked gently. Willow considered the question, looking around her simple cabin that now felt so warm and welcoming with Kirk's presence. "This year is different," she said softly. "I still miss him, I still grieve for the baby, but I'm beginning to see that life continues, that there can be joy again." Kirk's eyes, reflecting the dancing firelight, held hers for a long moment. "I'm glad," he said simply. The storm made it impossible for Kirk to return to his own ranch that night. Willow insisted he take the bed while she made a pallet before the fire, but Kirk refused, claiming he was perfectly comfortable on the floor. They fell asleep to the sound of the wind keening around the cabin eaves, the sturdy walls sheltering them from the wilderness beyond. Willow woke early on Christmas morning to find Kirk already up, adding wood to the stove and putting coffee on to boil. Outside, the storm had finally passed, leaving a transformed landscape of pristine white drifts and ice-laden trees that sparkled in the morning sunlight. "Merry Christmas," Kirk said, handing her a cup of steaming coffee. "Merry Christmas," she replied, suddenly shy in the intimate morning setting. "Thank you for coming yesterday. I don't know what I would have done if you'd have managed," Kirk interrupted with a smile. "You always do. But I'm glad I was here." After a breakfast of biscuits and honey, they exchanged gifts. Willow presented Kirk with her book of poetry, watching nervously as he turned the hand-sewn pages with careful fingers. "You wrote these?" he asked, genuine admiration in his voice as he read a few lines. Willow nodded. Over the past year, it helped to put the feelings into words. Kirk closed the book gently, clearly understanding the significance of the gift. "Thank you, I'll treasure it." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. "This isn't much, I'm afraid. I had something else planned, but it's back at the ranch." Willow unwrapped the package to find a beautifully carved wooden horse, small enough to fit in the palm of her hand but detailed with remarkable precision. "It's beautiful," she said, running her finger along the flowing mane. "Carved it myself," Kirk admitted. "Used to make them for my younger brothers when I was a boy. Thought you might like a reminder that there's beauty in simple things." The thoughtfulness of the gift touched Willow deeply. "I love it," she said sincerely. The rest of Christmas Day passed in peaceful companionship. They cleared paths to the barn and chicken coop, fed the animals, and even managed a short walk to enjoy the transformed landscape. As the short winter day began to fade, Kirk reluctantly prepared to return to his own ranch. "My hands will be wondering what happened to me," he explained as he saddled his horse. "And Mrs. Holloway will have my hide if I miss her Christmas supper entirely." "Of course," Willow said, trying to hide her disappointment at his departure. The brief time together had awakened feelings she had been trying to ignore for months, feelings that both excited and frightened her. "Thank you again for coming. It meant more than I can say." Kirk hesitated, then stepped closer, his expression serious. "Willow, there's something I've been wanting to ask you, something I've been thinking about for some time now." Willow's heart quickened. "Yes, would you?" Kirk began, then seemed to reconsider his words. "That is, I was wondering if you'd consider taking on the teaching position in town. Reverend Simmons mentioned they're still looking for someone for the spring term, and I know you were a teacher back east." The question was so unexpected that Willow could only blink in surprise. "Teaching?" "In Cottonwood Springs," Kirk nodded, suddenly looking uncertain. "I thought, with winter making the homestead difficult to manage alone and your experience, but of course it's entirely your decision. It's a good idea, Willow said slowly, hiding her irrational disappointment. What had she expected him to ask? I'll think about it. Kirk seemed about to say something more, but instead nodded and mounted his horse. Merry Christmas, Willow. Merry Christmas, Kirk, she replied, watching as he rode away, a solitary figure against the vast white landscape. January brought bitter cold and more snow, making the daily chores of homestead life increasingly difficult. Willow found herself considering Kirk's suggestion about the teaching position more seriously. It would provide a steady income, allow her to use her education, and most practically, mean she could stay in town during the worst of the winter, rather than struggling alone against the elements. When Kirk next visited, bringing mail from town and more books, Willow told him she had decided to apply for the position. That's wonderful, he said, genuine pleasure in his voice. The children will be fortunate to have you. I'll need to find lodging in town, Willow said. At least for the winter months. I can't make the journey back and forth each day, not with the snow. Mrs. Gardner, the doctor's wife, has rooms she lets to the occasional teacher or traveler, Kirk suggested, and it's only until spring. You can return to the homestead once the weather improves. Willow nodded, though the thought of leaving her home, even temporarily, filled her with uncertainty. This place held all her memories of Thomas, both painful and precious, yet she knew she needed to look forward, not back. The teaching position would be a step toward a new chapter in her life. The following week, Willow rode to town with Kirk for her interview with the town council. Reverend Simmons, who served as head of the school board, was clearly impressed with her qualifications and experience. By the end of the meeting, Willow had been officially hired to begin teaching in February, once the current winter break ended. Mrs. Gardner, a cheerful woman with graying hair and kind eyes, showed Willow the rooms above the doctor's office that would be her temporary home. It's not fancy, she apologized, but it's warm and clean and you'll have your privacy. It's perfect, Willow assured her, taking in the simple but comfortable furnishings. A bed, a small writing desk, a rocking chair by the window that overlooked the main street of Cottonwood Springs, it would serve her well for the remaining winter months. As February approached, Willow prepared for her temporary move to town. Kirk helped her secure the homestead, ensuring the barn was in good order and arranging for Ben to check on the livestock every few days. The day before she was to leave, Willow found herself sitting on the porch swing Kirk had built, despite the cold. The winter sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered yard, and in the distance, the mountains stood clear and sharp against the blue sky. The sound of approaching hoofbeats announced Kirk's arrival. He had promised to help transport her belongings to town, though she was taking only what she needed for the next few months: clothes, books, a few personal mementos. Ready for tomorrow? Kirk asked as he dismounted. I think so, Willow replied, though in truth she felt a strange reluctance to leave, even temporarily. It feels odd abandoning the place for so long. You're not abandoning it, Kirk said firmly, joining her on the swing. You're ensuring its future by earning money to keep it going. That's good stewardship, not abandonment, Willow smiled, grateful for his understanding. You always know what to say to ease my mind. Not always, Kirk replied with a self-deprecating smile. I've been known to put my foot squarely in my mouth on occasion. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the swing moving gently beneath them. Willow was acutely aware of Kirk beside her, his shoulder occasionally brushing hers, his profile strong against the winter landscape. Over the past months, he had become so much more than a neighbor or even a friend. He was the person she most wanted to share her thoughts with, whose opinion she valued above all others, whose presence brought a warmth to her heart that had nothing to do with the physical cold. What will you do with yourself now that you won't have my homestead to worry about? She asked lightly, trying to distract herself from these increasingly frequent thoughts. Kirk chuckled. Oh, I expect I'll find ways to fill the time. Spring calving isn't far off, and there's always fencing that needs repair. He paused, then added more seriously, "But I'll miss our conversations. Town's not that far, but it's not the same as being neighbors." "No," Willow agreed softly, "it's not." Before she could say more, Kirk reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small package. "I brought you something. A good luck gift for your new position." Surprised, Willow accepted the package and carefully unwrapped it. Inside was a small wooden box, beautifully crafted with a hinged lid. When she opened it, she found a silver fountain pen nestled in velvet. "Kirk, it's beautiful," she breathed, lifting the pen to examine its fine craftsmanship. "Every teacher needs a good pen," he said, looking pleased at her reaction, "for grading papers and writing notes and such." "Thank you," Willow said, deeply touched by the thoughtful gift. "I'll think of you whenever I use it." Kirk's eyes met hers, and something in his gaze made her heart beat faster. For a moment she thought he might say something more, might finally put into words the unspoken feelings that seemed to hover between them. But the moment passed, and Kirk simply smiled and rose to his feet. "We should get your things packed," he said. "Tomorrow we'll be here before we know it." The small schoolhouse in Cottonwood Springs was a simple one-room structure with rows of wooden desks facing a larger teacher's desk and blackboard. On her first day, Willow stood before 23 students ranging in age from 6 to 16, their faces a mix of curiosity, wariness, and in some cases, outright mischief. "Good morning," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "I am Mrs. Thornfield, and I will be your teacher for the remainder of the school year." The next weeks flew by in a blur of lesson plans, recitations, arithmetic problems, and the constant challenge of keeping order among children of widely varying ages and abilities. Willow found herself exhausted but fulfilled in a way she hadn't been since before Thomas's death. Teaching had always been her calling, and returning to it felt like coming home to a part of herself she had nearly forgotten. Living in town was an adjustment after the isolation of the homestead. Cottonwood Springs was small by Eastern standards, but to Willow, it seemed bustling with activity. She made new acquaintances, the storekeeper's wife, who invited her to join a quilting circle, the young telegrapher who saved newspapers from Denver for her to read, the blacksmith's daughter who became her brightest student. Kirk visited town regularly on ranch business, and he always made time to call on Willow. Sometimes they would share a meal at the small hotel restaurant, other times simply walk along the main street, talking about her students or his ranch. These visits became the highlights of Willow's weeks, moments she found herself anticipating with increasing eagerness. As March gave way to April, and the first signs of spring began to appear, Willow's thoughts turned more frequently to her homestead. Weekend visits confirmed that Ben had been taking good care of things in her absence, but she missed the place, the solitude, the connection to the land, the sense of building something that was truly her own. "You seem pensive today," Kirk observed one Saturday as they rode back to town after checking on the homestead. The prairie was beginning to green, patches of wildflowers appearing among the winter-dry grasses. "Just thinking about the future," Willow admitted. "The school term ends in May." "I'll be returning to the homestead full-time then." "Will you miss teaching?" Kirk asked. "Yes," Willow said without hesitation, "more than I expected to, but I miss the homestead too. It's hard feeling pulled in two directions." Kirk was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "What if you didn't have to choose? The school board is already talking about asking you to return in the fall. You could teach during the school terms and return to the homestead for summers and holidays." The suggestion made practical sense, but Willow frowned. "The journey back and forth would be difficult, especially once winter returns." "True," Kirk agreed, "unless you had help." Before Willow could ask what he meant, they crested a small rise and Cottonwood Springs came into view, ending their private conversation as they rejoined the bustle of town life. The following week brought an unexpected visitor to Willow's classroom. School had just been dismissed for the day, and she was erasing the blackboard when she heard a soft knock at the open door. Turning, she was surprised to see Mrs. Holloway standing there, a covered basket in her hands. "Mrs. Holloway, this is unexpected." The housekeeper smiled warmly. Hope I'm not interrupting, Mrs. Thornfield. I was in town for supplies and thought I'd bring you some of those molasses cookies you're fond of. That's very kind of you, Willow said, genuinely touched. Please come in, and you must call me Willow. After all we've been through, formality seems unnecessary. Mrs. Holloway entered, placing the basket on Willow's desk. Then you must call me Martha. Mrs. Holloway makes me feel ancient, though I suppose I'm getting there, Willow laughed. Hardly. Would you like some tea? I keep a pot in the cloakroom for after school. Over tea and cookies, the two women chatted easily. Martha spoke of spring preparations at the Blackwood Ranch, the new calves being born, and the garden she was planning. Mr. Blackwood's been different these past months, she observed casually, though her sharp eyes missed nothing of Willow's reaction. Happier, I'd say, more at peace. Has he, Willow said noncommittally, though her cheeks warmed. Martha nodded, known that man for 10 years now. Came to work for him when he was just starting out, living in a one-room cabin not much bigger than a closet. Watched him build that ranch from nothing. She paused, stirring her tea. Never seen him take an interest in a woman before you, though, not since I've known him. Willow nearly choked on her cookie. I'm sure you're mistaken, she managed. Mr. Blackwood has been a kind neighbor and friend, nothing more. Martha gave her a knowing look. If you say so, dear. But I've seen the way he watches for you when you're expected at the ranch, how he carves out time to ride into town when there's no real business to attend to. She reached across the table to pat Willow's hand, and I've seen how your face lights up when he appears. Embarrassed but unable to deny the truth of Martha's observations, Willow stared down at her teacup. It's complicated. Love usually is, Martha said matter-of-factly, especially when there's grief involved. But grief doesn't mean you can't find happiness again. Sometimes it's the very thing that helps us recognize joy when it comes knocking. After Martha left, Willow remained at her desk, the older woman's words echoing in her mind. Was it possible? Had she truly begun to fall in love with Kirk Blackwood? And more incredibly, could he possibly return those feelings? The thought both thrilled and terrified her. The following Sunday afternoon found Willow at her homestead again, taking advantage of the mild spring weather to work in her garden. The soil was finally warm enough to plant, and she was determined to get an early start this year. As she knelt in the freshly turned earth, pressing seeds into careful rows, she heard the now familiar sound of Kirk's horse approaching. Looking up, she shielded her eyes against the sun to watch him ride closer. There was something different about him today. He was wearing his good clothes rather than his usual work attire, and his horse was freshly groomed, its coat gleaming in the sunlight. You're dressed for church, Willow observed as he dismounted. I thought services were this morning. They were, Kirk confirmed, seeming uncharacteristically nervous as he removed his hat. I had some thinking to do afterward. Willow stood, brushing soil from her hands. Serious thoughts from the look of you. Kirk nodded, his gray eyes intent on her face. The most serious. Willow, would you walk with me? There's something I'd like to show you. Curious, Willow set aside her gardening tools and fell into step beside him. They walked in silence toward the creek that marked the eastern boundary of her property, where the land rose slightly to form a gentle hill overlooking both their properties. Spring had fully claimed this spot, with wildflowers dotting the grass and the cottonwood trees sporting fresh green leaves. At the top of the rise, Kirk stopped and gestured toward the view. What do you see? Willow looked out over the landscape, her modest homestead with its new barn, the creek winding its way across the prairie, and beyond, the larger expanse of the Blackwood Ranch stretching toward the distant mountains. I see home, she said simply, both yours and mine. Kirk turned to face her, his expression more open and vulnerable than she had ever seen it. That's what I see too, but lately I've been thinking that the boundary between them seems unnecessary. Willow's heart began to race as the implication of his words sank in. Kirk, please, he said softly, let me say this while I have the courage. He took a deep breath. Willow, when I first met you, you were Thomas's wife, and I respected that completely. After he died, you were a neighbor in need, and I tried to help as I would any friend. But somewhere along the way, without intending to, I fell in love with you. The words hung in the air between them, momentous and transformative. Willow felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were tears of astonishment and joy, not sorrow. "I know it might be too soon," Kirk continued when she didn't immediately respond. "I know you've suffered terrible losses, and I would never presume to replace what you've lost, but I want you to know that I love you, your strength, your kindness, your determination. And if there's any chance you might someday feel something similar for me, I would count myself the luckiest man in Wyoming territory." Willow looked up at him, this man who had become so essential to her happiness without her even realizing it. "It's not too soon," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Life is too precious and too uncertain to deny what we feel when we find it." Hope blazed in Kirk's eyes. "And what do you feel, Willow?" "I love you," she said simply, the words both a revelation and a confirmation of what her heart had known for months. "I think perhaps I have for some time now." Kirk's smile was like sunrise breaking across the prairie. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned down and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, tender and respectful, but it sent warmth spreading through Willow's entire being. When they parted, she felt as though something fundamental had shifted in her world, as if all the scattered pieces of her life were finally falling into their proper places. "I have a confession," Kirk said, taking her hands in his. "That swing I built wasn't just for you, it was for us, for the future I hoped we might share." His voice grew softer. "For the children yet to come, if you wanted them, with me." Tears spilled freely down Willow's cheeks now. "That's why you built it by the barn, not on my porch, so we could sit there together and watch the sunset over both our lands." Kirk nodded. "I know it's soon to speak of marriage, but yes," Willow interrupted, surprising herself with her certainty. "Yes, I will marry you, Kirk Blackwood." The joy that transformed his face was answer enough, but he gathered her into his arms and kissed her again, this time with a passion that left no doubt of his feelings. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Kirk rested his forehead against hers. "I promise you, Willow Thornfield, that I will spend every day making you glad you said yes." They were married in May, as the prairie exploded with wildflowers and new life. The ceremony was held outdoors, on the hill where Kirk had proposed, with Reverend Simmons officiating and the entire community of Cottonwood Springs in attendance. Willow wore a new dress of pale blue silk that Martha had helped her make, and Kirk looked handsome and slightly overwhelmed in his best suit. After the ceremony, the celebration moved to the Blackwood Ranch, where tables had been set up under the cottonwood trees, and a fiddler played cheerful tunes for dancing. As the sun began to set, Kirk took Willow's hand and led her away from the festivities to where a wagon waited, hitched and ready. "A surprise," he explained as he helped her up to the seat, "if you're willing to slip away for a bit." The wagon ride was short, just over the rise to Willow's homestead, though it would soon be simply their second property, as they had decided to make the larger Blackwood Ranch house their primary home. As they approached the cabin, Willow gasped in surprise. The entire front of the small structure had been transformed. A wide, covered porch now wrapped around two sides, its sturdy pillars supporting a sloped roof that would provide shade in summer and shelter in winter. And there, in the center of the porch, hung the swing Kirk had originally built by the barn, now moved to this more prominent position. "When did you do this?" Willow asked, amazed. She had been staying in town for the final weeks of the school term and hadn't visited the homestead in over a week. "The men and I have been working on it every spare moment," Kirk admitted. "I wanted it to be ready today." He helped her down from the wagon and led her up the new steps to the porch. Together, they sat on the swing, its gentle motion as soothing as ever. From this vantage point, they could see across the rolling prairie to the Blackwood Ranch in the distance, where lanterns twinkled like earthbound stars and the sounds of celebration drifted on the evening breeze. "It's perfect," Willow said, leaning her head against Kirk's shoulder. "A beautiful wedding gift. The first of many, I hope," Kirk replied, his arm secure around her waist. I thought this could be our special place, a retreat when we need quiet or a place to bring our children someday." He paused, then added softly, "All the children yet to come." Willow turned to look at him, love swelling in her heart for this man who understood so perfectly what she needed, who honored her past even while helping her build a future. "I'd like that very much," she said, and kissed him as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The years that followed brought challenges and joys in equal measure, as life on the frontier always did. The Blackwood Ranch prospered under Kirk and Willow's joint management, with Willow bringing her organizational skills and education to complement Kirk's practical experience. She continued teaching at the Cottonwood Springs School, riding in with Kirk when weather permitted and staying in town during the worst winter months, though never for as long as that first year. The little homestead cabin became their special retreat, a place they would escape to when they needed time alone together away from the busy ranch. The porch swing became Willow's favorite spot for reading, for watching sunsets, and eventually for nursing their firstborn child. Catherine Sarah Blackwood arrived almost exactly 2 years after their wedding, a healthy, robust baby with her father's gray eyes and her mother's determined spirit. Willow had been terrified throughout the pregnancy, haunted by memories of her previous loss, but Dr. Gardner had monitored her carefully, and Kirk had been a constant source of strength and reassurance. When they placed the newborn daughter in Willow's arms, the joy was all the sweeter for the grief that had preceded it. Kirk, sitting beside her on the bed, touched the baby's tiny hand with wonder. "She's perfect," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Just like her mother." As Catherine grew from infant to toddler, the porch swing became her favorite place as well. She would beg to be pushed higher, higher while she giggled with delight, her dark curls bouncing with each motion. On quiet evenings, Kirk would sit with Catherine on his lap and Willow beside them, telling stories about the stars overhead or the animals that called the prairie home. When Catherine was 3, she was joined by a brother, James Thomas Blackwood, named for the grandfather he would never meet and the half-brother who had never drawn breath. James was followed 2 years later by twins, Robert and Elizabeth, completing their family in a way that sometimes left Willow breathless with gratitude when she considered how differently her life might have unfolded. On a warm summer evening 10 years after their wedding, Willow sat on the porch swing of the homestead cabin, watching her 4 children play in the yard below. Kirk had taken them fishing at the creek earlier, and now they were engaged in an elaborate game of their own invention, their laughter carrying on the gentle breeze. Kirk joined her on the swing, handing her a cup of coffee. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Blackwood." Willow smiled at the familiar phrase. "I was just thinking about how full our lives are, how blessed." Kirk followed her gaze to their children, Catherine, tall and graceful at 8, James, sturdy and serious at 5. And the twins, Robert and Elizabeth, exuberant 3-year-olds who exhausted and delighted everyone in equal measure. "We are blessed indeed," he agreed, his arm settling comfortably around her shoulders. "More than I ever dreamed possible." Willow leaned into his embrace, thinking of all they had weathered together, droughts and blizzards. A devastating cattle illness that had nearly ruined them 5 years back, her own difficult recovery after the twins' birth. Through it all, their love had only deepened, tempered by challenges into something unbreakable. "Do you ever think about that first year?" she asked softly. "When we were just neighbors and I was so determined to manage alone," Kirk chuckled. "I think about it often, how stubborn you were. How much I admired that, even while it frustrated me beyond measure." "I needed that time," Willow reflected, "to grieve, to find my own strength, but I'm so glad you were patient enough to wait until I was ready to see what was right in front of me." "I would have waited forever," Kirk said simply. Below them in the yard, Catherine had organized her siblings into a line and was teaching them a clapping game she had learned at school. James followed her instructions with solemn concentration, while the twins dissolved into giggles every few seconds, unable to maintain the necessary seriousness for the game. "Look at them," Willow said, her heart so full it almost hurt. "The children who came after so much loss. The family we built together." Kirk's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of a decade's partnership. And it all started with a porch swing, he said, his voice warm with memory. A porch swing for the children yet to come, Willow agreed, as the swing moved gently beneath them and the Wyoming sun sank toward the horizon, painting the prairie gold.